Dear friends, welcome back to our weekly philosophical talks with Stephen Friedman. First of all, we would like to announce that Stephen Friedman is the New York Times acclaimed great philosopher, an artist, and also a great speaker of ours and a scientist. And we would like to give big thanks to Stephen Friedman for joining us weekly, and also very big thanks to the US Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and also you, the audience, for joining us weekly. Please make sure to give your comments, ask your questions. We will definitely address them in the end of the next talks. Stephen, thank you very much for joining us. Have a great talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Aaliyah, and the good wishes. I want to thank you, as always, for your ongoing participation, for facilitating these talks, moderating them. I also want to thank the American Consulate in Almaty, Elmira, Dana, everyone involved in providing this platform for philosophical explorations of a wide range of contemporary issues, often conjoined with international days. That is the case tonight. Today, again, I'm in Los Angeles, so it's my evening. On February 21st, we celebrate International Mother Language Day. So I took that as the inspiration for tonight's talk for a variety of reasons. The subtitle is The Philosophy of Language, Our Societal Spaces. It's actually an enormous topic in the history of philosophy, the philosophy of language itself. It's been a major focus, especially of contemporary philosophers, and was a major focus of mine, especially when I was studying philosophy in college and before. I wrote out a series of topics, an outline. I'm a little concerned that I'm being in my outlining of this talk a little more ambitious than I'm going to be able to fulfill, but we'll see how many of these topics I can get through. I wanted to begin with a quotation from the books of Joshua. Now, I've recited things from the books of Joshua before. It is an autobiographical work that deals with my primarily intellectual development, not exclusively, but also deals with the development of my philosophical ideas, my interest in philosophy. There's and it's in verse. It's basically a novel in verse that is lightly fictionalized. The main character has the name of Joshua, but that is really my alter ego. So early on, there is the following paragraph again, a verse as the entire work is written. A mother tongue is warm and young, whispered. Actually, I just memorized this and I don't want to make mistakes. Whispered, accented, or sung. The second language cannot give the... Okay, I'm going to have to read this. I'm sorry. Okay. The second language cannot give the sharpness of a primal sieve. A philosopher yearns for subtlety in every choice of terms. Even more than metaphor, the sculpted key of poetry, reality is stringency, as every prophet quickly learns. To glean the depth of being, that even a seer is rarely seeing, words must be weighed as carefully as diamond is assayed. Joshua knew what words are due, and his hands grew sore as he scraped and tore to bore to meaning's core. So that sets the stage for our exploration of language and of the significance of the mother tongue in particular. It is especially relevant to philosophy because of the precision and the subtlety of philosophical writing and investigation. There is, within the State Department, a system of classification of language expertise. People are evaluated on a 1 to 5 scale, assessed on a 1 to 5 scale. 5 means you are a native speaker of a language. It's your mother tongue. And so you can craft slang, you can help advance the language, you can create new forms, new vocabulary. That is the exclusive prerogative of a 5, someone born into the language. Philosophy, the writing of philosophy, demands the level of expertise of a 5. No major philosopher has written philosophy in an acquired language. It's happened in other enterprises. It's happened in literature. The famous English novelist Joseph Conrad learned English relatively late. I think he was 19 or so, the end of his teenage years, and became nevertheless one of the greatest English writers, one of the greatest novelists in the language. That is not seen in philosophy. It's not seen partly because of the devotion of philosophers to writing in their native tongue, in their mother tongue, no matter what. The probably most famous modern example of the necessity to explore philosophy from that avenue, the avenue of the native language, is Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher. I've referred to him many times. He is one of the great philosophers of the 19th century, one of the greatest philosophers who's ever lived, and considered the originator of existentialism, though he didn't use that term. Well, let me show you an image of Kierkegaard that I've shown before. Okay, so there is a drawing of Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard had facility at languages. He was gifted. He'd certainly grown up within a classical educational tradition that had required him to master Latin, Greek, but he knew other languages as well. He always and only wrote philosophy in Danish, to his chagrin, to his eternal pain, because he recognized the reality that Danish had an inherently limited audience. Most people do not read Danish. Most people in the early 19th century, the mid-19th century, did not have direct access to that language. And so it was a century or more before Kierkegaard became fully appreciated for the philosophical contributions that he had made. He always lamented the fact that Danish was his mother language, but because, again, it provided limited exposure, a limited audience. But even so, he didn't devote himself to writing in another language, in a second language, in an acquired language. Again, the subtlety of the philosophical enterprise demands the mother tongue. Same thing is true in the case of Wittgenstein, who I will be talking about in a number of contexts in this talk, because of his central role in the advancement of the philosophical understanding of the nature of language. And Wittgenstein was Austrian by birth. He, though, spent most of his career, his academic career, at Cambridge University. He spoke English with the accent of an educated Englishman. He always and only wrote in German, wrote philosophy in German, again, because of the demands of the subject. I've dabbled in languages. I haven't, it's not one of my strengths, partly because when I was young, I had a speech impediment that I've spoken about in Phalaris's Bull. I had trouble pronouncing L's, and it made me self-conscious. And so I was never, and then I can't roll R's. I never, I guess, heard that sound growing up. So I was always self-conscious, and I shied away from the study of language. But I, on various occasions, would explore a language up to a point. Like I studied German to be able to read it. When I was dealing with IKEA, when we had this meeting over the possibility of their changing the direction of their company and doing with art what they had done with furnishings, and they had an interest in doing it with my art or my type of art. The month before our meeting in Sweden, I studied Swedish. Now, you can only acquire so much proficiency within a month, but still, I devoted myself to it. And I was deliberate about it, and I immersed myself. I used convergence theory, right? You listen to things in Swedish, you read things, you write things, you try to, again, immerse yourself in the language as if you were in the culture, which forces that immersion. Then I got to Sweden, and I found that everybody spoke English better than I would ever speak Swedish. And it quickly, that whatever facility I had acquired, which was limited, left me. I've done something comparable with a dozen or so languages over the years, but never to a point of fluency, and certainly never, to any degree of mastery, which would not be open to me in the acquiring of a second language, not at the level of linguistic expertise demanded of philosophy. And so when I was young, relatively young, a teenager, I was reading a lot of things in translation. I wasn't as sensitive to the sound and the structure of the English language. At some point, I discovered through Shakespeare, the inherent beauty of English. And from that point onward, when the sound of the language became decisive to me, I really read very little in translation. And in the same way, as I became committed to writing philosophy, to doing philosophy, my focus on English narrowed and became sharper and sharper because of the demands of philosophy itself. The issue of philosophy and language, as I said, has been central to the philosophical enterprise for, a very long time now, at least a couple of centuries, but especially dominated philosophical thinking and activity in the 20th century. And we can understand what draws philosophical issues and philosophical concern to focus upon language, that our questions, the questions that we raise philosophically about the world are expressed linguistically. What is the world? What is existence? What is being? What are we? What is the self? I talked about the Delphic Oracle, know thyself. What is the nature of the self that we are trying to come to terms with? And so all of these fundamental questions are expressed in language. And so it's reasonable to focus upon language as the medium, in which these questions are at least being represented, if not arising fundamentally. This kind of focus led to considerations as to the nature of the meaning of a word, the nature of the meaning of a concept. Again, because if we're investigating the nature of existence, well, what is the nature of the meaning of the terms that we're using? Maybe that can provide illumination. provide a guide, provide perhaps an essential guide, into the exploration and the answering of those questions. The person that made the strongest contribution to the philosophical inquiry into the nature of language, arguably, is Wittgenstein, Ludwig Wittgenstein, 20th century philosopher that I've referred to repeatedly. He's been the most important influence upon my work. I'll show you again. Here's an image of Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein's career is divided into two phases. He wrote early in his life a work, the only work he published in his lifetime, a very short volume, 80 pages or so, written in aphoristic form. Now, his style of writing did not influence mine, but it just so happens that I am drawn to the aphoristic style. He was drawn to the aphoristic style. Other philosophers in the history of the subject have been drawn because of the precision and the concentration, the urgency that such a style communicates. Heraclitus, the great obscure Greek philosopher who has come down to us in fragments, famously, was an early aphoristic writer of philosophy, though maybe it's just that that's what has been preserved. But in any case, that type of philosophical writing has prevailed as an important style within the subject, within the field. Pascal, Nietzsche, again, Wittgenstein, Schopenhauer were all drawn to the aphorism. Wittgenstein's early book was called the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. I'm going to show you the title just so you see it. Now, interestingly, it's usually referred to as the Tractatus. 80 pages of concentrated statements about the nature of language, the nature of the world, the nature of a logical proposition, the form of a proposition, the logical form of a proposition. It could take us several lectures to explore it in some detail. One thing I wanted to note about it is notice the title is Latin, Tractatus, treatise. Wittgenstein wrote that book in German. He did not propose this title. The title came actually from G.E. Moore, a philosopher also at Cambridge in the early part of the 20th century, that I referred to in a recent talk as having attended a lecture by Wittgenstein, where Moore wrote down the comment, it did not matter whether his results were correct or not. What mattered was that a method had been found. Well, that's the philosopher who proposed this title. It's an obscure work. It's a difficult work. And it's one of the most influential works in the history of the subject, in the history of philosophy. For our purposes, what's important about it is it represents a certain view of the nature of language. And that view can be summarized as language providing a picture of the world, just as there's a correspondence between a painting, let's say, of a landscape and the landscape itself. There's the relationships within the painting, the trees, the fields, the structures, the homes, whatever might be depicted in the landscape have a similar set of relationships within the painting to what one sees in the actual landscape itself, right? The picture, the painting is picturing, the landscape, and preserves the fundamental relationships found in nature. It's that metaphor, that image, that concept of language that the Tractatus is based upon and explores. The notion that the logical form of a proposition, as Wittgenstein would like to say, was mirrored the actual relational structure of reality. So, for example, if we say, the chair is against the wall, the words are representing the reality as a picture would be depicting a reality if the picture were painting that situation of the chair against the wall. It's also based upon a certain view of the nature of meaning, that fundamentally the meaning of a word is the object for which the word stands. It's almost a common sense notion, right? The idea that, well, what's a chair? Okay, I have a chair here, okay? The meaning of chair is that object, right? That seems to make sense. That can be extended to any set of terms, right? More or less. Of course, the less is what becomes increasingly important as this notion is explored. But it also gave rise to this idea that since language is picturing the world, picturing our reality, picturing our experience, that language is only meaningful within the world in those relationships, in the context of picturing that reality. Wittgenstein would famously conclude the Tractatus with propositions like, not how the world is the mystical, but that it is. Or that whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. One cannot, for Wittgenstein's view of language, speak of the mystical. That goes beyond the realm of language as depicting the reality. I'm sketching this view. And as I said, Wittgenstein was especially preoccupied with this idea of the logical form of a proposition. So how exactly the proposition, the statement, the claim is mirroring the reality, picturing the world. There is a fundamental problem with that view. The way I critique it is it's a view of the world, a view of the relationship between language and the world, as if we could see the world from the outside, so that we could see the reality, see the linguistic proposition, and see the nature of the connection between the two. I've emphasized repeatedly that one way to explore the sources of our perplexities, one way to identify them is with that view that we can see the world from the outside. It is a view that arises because of the nature of language. We'll explore that in a little bit. But Wittgenstein turned away from the view in the Tractatus, not from the analysis I've just given, that sense of the problematic nature of a claim that's predicated upon seeing the world from the outside. But based on a visit that he received, he left philosophy after he wrote the Tractatus. He thought he had solved all philosophical problems. It was a cause of irritation among other philosophers at the time. They thought Wittgenstein was arrogant. Wittgenstein recognized his own arrogance. He wrote to Bertrand Russell after he had written the Tractatus, saying that he had solved all the problems that they had been working on. He knows that may sound arrogant, but that's what he fully believes. And so he needs to say it. And he went on further to say that he's written a difficult book, a book that's written in concentrated propositions that would need to be explained to Russell for Bertrand Russell fully to understand them. And Wittgenstein went on to say that given that circumstance, that they need to be explained, obviously no one will understand them. Well, people did come to terms with the Tractatus largely probably because it's presenting a common sense, a prevalent view of the nature of language as depicting the reality. But after he left philosophy, Wittgenstein, like in the 1920s, went to Norway, built a hut, lived in a small abode overlooking a lake in Norway. He was ascetic. He was born into one of the wealthiest families in Austria. He mostly gave away his wealth. He was a patron of painters, of artists. He himself lived effectively an ascetic life. So he was living away from the academic world. He was no longer interested in the academic world because he resolved every philosophical problem to his mind, which is actually that is the goal of any real major philosopher. In fact, one could say the goal of philosophy is to end philosophy. To end the inquiry, to resolve every issue. That's what one aspires to. Not to, create results that then can be further explored by the next generation. No, we want to end the problems here and now, as Sir Arthur Galton wanted to end disease, old age, and death there and then, once and for all. Same thing applies, at the highest levels of philosophical ambition. It's not a gratuitous ambition. It's because the problems matter, and so their solutions matter. They matter in terms of our whole relationship to the world, to existence, to ourselves. Well, when Wittgenstein was living this isolated life, having resolved to his satisfaction all philosophical problems, he was visited by someone he had known at Cambridge, an Italian economist, Staffa. Wittgenstein and Staffa had apparently often been engaged in philosophical conversations. Wittgenstein had such a conversation with Staffa on this visit that Staffa paid him. And Wittgenstein was talking about the logical form of a proposition, right? And how it's mirroring the reality. And Staffa made a gesture, an Italian gesture. I think it's a gesture of disgust or dismissal, this kind of gesture. Okay, it's I think it's a rude gesture, but I'm not within that culture, so I don't know all the trappings of it. But he made that gesture. Could have made a variety of gestures. The point is, he made a gesture, and he then asked Wittgenstein, "What is the logical form of that?" And with that question, Wittgenstein realized that his view of language as articulated and developed in the Tractatus, this relatively common sense view of language picturing the reality, was fundamentally wrong. And at that point, since Wittgenstein now believed that he had not, in fact, achieved his purpose, that the solutions he thought he had achieved were not definitive, were not satisfactory in the end, he returned to philosophy and went back to Cambridge, was given a PhD based upon the Tractatus, which had been published and which was celebrated at that point, and began to do the work that led to a second work of his, not published in his lifetime, published posthumously, the Philosophical Investigations. And that's the work that probably Wittgenstein's reputation is largely based upon today, that subsequent work. The view of the Tractatus is linked to the views, the writings of other philosophers, other approaches to the subject, that were prevalent in one form or another historically. Philosophical Investigations takes a radically new approach and direction and achieves radically new insights. into the nature of language. For the investigations, Wittgenstein, and again, he didn't quite use these terms that I'm going to use, but Wittgenstein, rather than attempting to describe the world from without, is now committed to describing the world from within. And he sees language as not depicting a reality that can be observed independently of the world if we could, again, see it from the outside. He sees language as an instrument of a form of life, as making possible a whole mode of existence, and is not being dissociatable from that form of life that it makes possible, that it facilitates. The revolutionary insight into the nature of meaning is that the meaning of a word is not the object for which the word stands, as if, again, we could stand outside the world, see the word, see the object, see their relationship, but rather the use of that word within that form of life. Talks about the concept of a language game, which again is a kind of a subset, of a culture in which language facilitates certain types of behaviors, of relationships between human beings, relationships involving human beings and the world, but language and the words of that language only have their meaning within the structure of that life. There are famous aphorisms that Wittgenstein wrote in relation to that view to help articulate it. Words are deeds. Words are not labels. They are deeds. They are connected to our behaviors. Another famous remark from late in, actually from the end, towards the end of the Philosophical Investigations, which was an uncompleted work, by the way, is, if a lion could talk, we could not understand it because we do not participate in its form of life. So again, it's a view of language that stresses our inability to see the world from the outside. It's taking the same type of view to language that Einstein and Heisenberg take to their attempt at describing the physics of our world, where those descriptions are based upon seeing the world from within, from where we stand, not from some Archimedean, external, eternal point, not from a perspective of a God that we imagine looking down on the reality in total, but from where we are. And that turns out, obviously, in the case of physics, in the case of relativity and quantum mechanics, to be the more powerful approach, the epistemic approach, the existential approach, because we can't see the world, can't leave the world to view it. Well, the same thing pertains with Wittgenstein's analysis of language. It is more powerful because it is more germane to our essential circumstance within the world, within our form of life. Now, Wittgenstein began the Philosophical Investigations with a quotation from St. Augustine, where St. Augustine details this common sense view of language as sort of labeling the world, labeling the reality, mirroring the reality. Wittgenstein began the investigations with that view, which is ultimately the view at the core of the Tractatus, his early work, and which is ultimately the view that he's going to repudiate. He begins it with St. Augustine. He says, not because he can't find that view expressed elsewhere. It's a common sense view. It's a common view of the nature of language. But he says, because the fact that so great a mind as Augustine held that view meant it had to be important. Not necessarily true, not necessarily correct, but important. That's an important point of view to take. I've emphasized that when encountering the work of any sort of major historical, intellectual figure, a Siddhartha Gautama, it's not enough just to dismiss his or her work out of hand because it seems obvious to you that it's not consonant with contemporary accounts of the world or our experience. Because so great a mind as the Buddha or as St. Augustine held their views meant they are worthwhile exploring. We will gain from that inquiry. I'm going to read you the Augustine paragraph just because it begins the investigations. It represents, depicts the view of the Tractatus, and again, that common sense view of words labeling things, words as the meaning of a word being the object for which the word stands. And it goes like this. And again, it's the first paragraph of the investigations, the philosophical investigations. And it's from St. Augustine's Confessions, by the way, which is an autobiographical work of his. When they called something by name, St. Augustine writes, and he's writing as, describing what he experienced as a child, and pointed it out while they spoke. I saw it. I saw what they were pointing to, and realized that the thing they wished to indicate was called by the name that they uttered, right? The word is labeling the object. And what they meant was made plain by the gestures of their body. They point, right? It's clear what they're pointing to. By a kind of natural language common to all nations, which expresses itself through changes of countenance, facial expressions, glances of the eye, gestures, and intonations, tone of voice, which indicate a disposition and attitude either to seek or to possess, to reject or to avoid, get me a glass, avoid that fire, don't touch the stove, whatever it is. So it was that by frequently hearing words in different phrases, I gradually identified the objects which the word stood for, right? The word and the object that it stands for, that represents the meaning of the word. And having formed my mouth to repeat these signs, I was thereby able to express my will. That's the view that Wittgenstein elaborates fundamentally in the Tractatus. That is, again, this common sense view that he tears apart in the philosophical investigations to our greater understanding of the nature of language, and so the nature of our questions about the world, and the nature of our circumstances, and of the philosophical problems that we are asking about the world and about our circumstances. Well, Wittgenstein follows that example of language learning, and really, that's an example that's a sense of language that applies to the learning of a second language, not the primary language, not the mother tongue. When we're learning the mother tongue initially, we don't even know what a pointing gesture means. We don't know what somebody's pointing at. A shape, an object. What's an object exactly? A point of light, an edge. What exactly? So it takes a lot of cultural and linguistic development even to just be able to make sense of the pointing gesture. So when we hear that account that Augustine gives, we again find it's really applicable to a second language, where in fact one of the ways of learning a second language is to go around and label everything. When I was learning Swedish, over that period of a month, that's in fact what I did. I put labels, for, Swedish words for chair and table and book, just on all the objects in my environment. That common sense view of language is actually the view of learning a second language, not the mother tongue. The mother tongue is really acquiring the mother tongue is a matter not acquiring a set of words. It's a matter of acquiring, again, a form of life. So, here's the simple situation that Wittgenstein presents to try to distill the real nature of language. He simplifies it down to imagining a culture where they're engaged in building. Okay, I'm paraphrasing this, and I haven't looked at his original account for some time. Let's say the culture at one point, or certain individuals in the culture are dedicated to building structures. Okay, and let's say they're by a quarry of some sort, and the quarry has bricks that they've prepared, and it has stones. Okay, piles of bricks, piles of stones. And let's say that a short distance away is the person that's going to be assembling the structure, the house, right? The abode, out of these bricks and stones. And we're imagining the language that consists of the communication between the person assembling, building the house, and the person at the quarry who will bring that individual the stones or the bricks. The person, and we can imagine the person saying the word, we can imagine the person showing a sign that has a word on it, okay? A symbol. The person at the site where the house is being erected might call out brick 2. What that means is person at the quarry brings 2 bricks over to the site where the house is being made and then returns to the quarry. Maybe it'll be stone 3. 3 stones get lifted up and delivered over to the quarry. Let's say that is the entire language. We're imagining now a specific form of life or a context where these individuals are engaged in building. Okay? We see that if we ask them, what's the meaning of brick? Well, in that context, it means pick up this object and bring it over. Now, one of the fundamental questions that perplexed philosophers over the centuries was how, if the meaning of a word is the object for which the word stands, a word can have meaning if the object for which it stands doesn't exist. Like unicorn. How can, if the meaning of a word is the object for which the word stands, how can unicorn, which doesn't exist, mean anything? Well, Wittgenstein uses that simple, what he calls language game, to illustrate. He says, let's say that the person engaged in the building process calls out brick 2. But let's say there are no more bricks. And maybe the bricks are sort of, beneath the visible surface. They're in a little pit or something, a quarry, right? Well, what's that person receiving that communication supposed to do? It's not clear what that person will do. In that context of that very simplified language, as we've outlined it, the communication brick, where there are no longer any bricks, has no meaning. Because there's no way that person receiving that message can respond to it. But let's say that when there are no longer any bricks, the person receiving that communication shakes his head or says no. Now, that word brick has meaning in the absence of an object for which that word stands. Now, this is a very simplified, picture of obviously a very complex phenomenon, right? How language functions. But It's what Wittgenstein uses at the beginning of the philosophical investigations to clarify this fundamental notion that the meaning of a word is its use within the form of life that has developed. And language is part of that development. There's going back to Joshua, here's another quotation early on from Joshua. It's kind of generically about words and language. We seek the sense beyond the sound. What we seek will not be found. Words obscure the fertile ground where words knee-deep abound. Now that's poetry and philosophy, and as I've emphasized, when you combine those two, it can become especially difficult. But the sound can communicate, and that's important in how English, in fact, communicates, and my aphorisms also communicate. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so language is a facilitator. I emphasize that we have to understand language in the same way that we understand the physics of our world, relativity and quantum mechanics, from within. The reality of language is that it is not facilitating a communication of ideas. Without language, there would be no ideas to communicate. What language fundamentally is doing is facilitating societal coordination. It allows us to engage with other human beings and achieve ends, achieve results that promote our survival within groups that are capable of achieving results that exceed what individuals can do on their own. It facilitates collective enterprise, collective effort, and that is as essential for human survival as any particular human capacity or functionality. Right? I mean, it was Pascal that famously remarked that human beings are frail compared to gorillas or even chimpanzees. Our physical strength, does not rise to the level of the physical strength of a chimpanzee. Even, every now and then one hears of encounters, violent encounters between human beings and chimpanzees. There are maulings. Well, after any one such encounter, one will always read an article saying that the strongest human being on earth cannot contend with a chimpanzee one-on-one. Their upper body strength, they live in trees. They climb trees with ease. That's one of the hard things for human beings to do. Our upper body strength has diminished evolutionarily since we went from a tree-focused life in our boreal existence to a terrestrial, a ground-based life as bipedal, two-legged organisms. Right? So we don't have the strength to contend, with a lion or with a tiger or with a chimpanzee. But Pascal emphasized that our intellectual capacity allows us to survive within challenging natural circumstances that we would otherwise not be able to flourish within. Well, but again, Pascal is talking about intellectual capacity as if we can think, sort of independently of language as an apparatus. Well, what really facilitates our survival is our ability to coordinate as groups of human beings. Our cultures, our civilizations, our technologies, our greatest achievements are all the result of ongoing group efforts. What facilitates group effort is language. Language, if we want to say it exists, for any particular purpose, it is for that purpose, to facilitate our coordination of behavior with others, not our communication with our thoughts. That comes subsequent, once we have the instrumentality of language at our disposal, because it is a societal instrument. One way to appreciate this is there's a problem, fundamental problem in the history of philosophy, the mind-body problem. The mind is within, the body is what others see. How do you know that somebody that you're encountering has a mind? You're not encountering their mind directly. You're not, again, entering their mind, as the film Being John Malkovich imagined one can do. So how does one know? How do you disprove solipsism, the view that you are the only consciousness in the world? Where does that sense come from that when you are seeing another human being, when you're engaging with another human being, you're engaging with, well, let's speak metaphorically, a soul, a consciousness, someone that, has an inner life, because you're not encountering that inner life directly, right? By, if you like, the definition of inner life. Well, the simple fact of the matter is you are effectively encountering their inner life when you are engaged in communication, when you are engaged in coordination of your behavior with theirs, your articulations, your utterances that elicit responses. I engage with squirrels, right? For me, I learn a great deal. It's an opportunity for me to learn from wildlife, right? I'm drawn more to squirrels and to dogs and cats because they're not domesticated. They're wild animals. They're wild mammals. They live in trees, so they share some of our ancestry. There are capacities that they have that can illuminate aspects of our life, our existence. Well, it's easy to imagine a squirrel, an animal, an insect, whatever it is, as being purely instinctual, as being effectively a machine, acting and reacting without a consciousness, without an inner life. Very easy to do that. There are these kinds of debates ongoing. Does an animal, does an insect, have consciousness, and to what degree? Well, the more I have engaged with squirrels, the more I can call them. If I say something like, it's okay, they will come. If they come for nuts and they start to go run away, and I say, it's okay, they'll stop, they'll turn around. There's an engagement. There is an elemental level of communication. If I go outside and I make certain sounds, if I see them in trees, they will come. Once they began responding in that way to some of my words, some of my gestures, I began to see them with an inner life. If other human beings were not engaging with us, if we were not communicating with others, if every attempt at communication was ignored, was met with indifference, was not eliciting any type of response, if the behavior of the people that we were engaged with was not altered at all by our actions, our words, then we would conclude that these other human beings were robotic, were automata, were beings without consciousness. The sense of an inner life is a function of our ability to communicate within a societal framework, which means our ability to influence the behavior of others. So, Language, again, fundamentally is an instrument of human coordination, and everything else follows from that. And I should make a comment, it's a comment I've made also in the past, that it's because language is socially grounded, a social instrumentality, that it leads us to think of the world as if we were seeing it from outside ourselves. Because when we are imagining other people, collectives, groups that we're engaging with, we are entertaining the idea of seeing the world from that person's perspective or someone else's perspective. It is lifting us out of ourselves. Well, that is helpful as an instrument of survival, of technology, of societal coordination, but it is the ultimate source of our pain and our confusions, again, because we think we can see the world from outside ourselves. We think we can see the world from outside the world. This is a fundamental illusion, one could say the fundamental illusion that language facilitates. So we want to keep that in mind when we are addressing final solutions to philosophical problems. I've again summarized some of these issues by saying the ultimate source of human suffering is the belief that we can see the world from outside the world. The solution to the problem of human suffering is that the world is different in different directions. That difference in different directions is the manifestation, if you like, of the epistemic, the imprint of the epistemic, rigorous distinction. Okay. I want to say some things, we have time, good, about English itself, my mother tongue. English derives from two linguistic streams, the Germanic and the Latinic, right? Latin and German, Anglo-Saxon. The fusion of the two began in 1066 with the conquest of England by William of Normandy, subsequently William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror from Normandy, northern France, spoke French. When he invaded England and he brought his troops with him, they brought French to a Germanic-speaking island, an Anglo-Saxon world. The subsequent history of English is the fusion of these two linguistic streams that began 1066. It took a long time for these streams to fuse. When you look at English today, many of the words in the language are monosyllabic, have a single syllable, of, for, by, prepositions, world, earth. The words of a single syllable are typically of Germanic extraction in the language. The words of multiple syllables, like origination, are words of Latin, French derivation. The development of English has partly been the coalescing of those two streams and those two monosyllabic versus polysyllabic components. It's a process that achieved its final state of integration fundamentally in the work of Shakespeare. It took about 500 years. Now, Shakespeare is not renowned because he achieved that fusion. Shakespeare is renowned because of the greatness of his writing. At its best, it is at the highest level of human literary expression. because of that elevation, of Shakespeare's achievement, Shakespeare effectively fixed the language. In other words, the language that we speak today. Modern English is effectively Shakespearean English because Shakespeare was that important, that great, that everyone has been devoted to studying him ever since. We do not speak the English of Chaucer, not because English had to develop beyond Chaucer, but because Chaucer was not as great as Shakespeare. And so we don't read Chaucer with the devotion and the frequency, and the dedication that we read Shakespeare, with which we read Shakespeare. It's been said that somewhere in the world, a Shakespeare play is being performed every day. Well, he is certainly central to the experience of the language. And if you read him, now obviously there have been changes, but relatively minor changes, over time. If you read Shakespeare carefully, slowly, and at his greatest, it's modern English. Here are some examples. It is the cause. Now, he's a poet, and he's extremely powerful intelligence. So his work would be demanding no matter what the language he was working in. But just listen, it is the cause. It is the cause, my soul. Let me not name it to you, you chaste stars. It is the cause. Yet I'll not shed her blood, nor scar that whiter skin of hers than snow, and smooth as monumental alabaster. This is from Othello, one of his great tragedies. Yet she must die, else she'll betray more men. Put out the light and then put out the light. That's modern English. We find that throughout Shakespeare's writing. We also find the emphasis upon the monosyllable. What I just recited has, I think I counted something like 33 monosyllables in a row. It is the cause. It is the cause, my soul. Shakespeare is writing he's stabbing with words, if you like. Okay? He's writing with great strength of choice of word. And he's balancing it with polysyllables. Yet I'll not shed her blood, nor scar that whiter skin of hers than snow, and smooth as monumental alabaster. Here we have the Latin derivation of words. But monumental, we go from monosyllables to polysyllables, often at the end. That integration of the Germanic monosyllable in English and the Latinate polysyllable is central to the English tongue and to the writing of effective English. It is central to the structure of the aphorisms I write. The incontrovertible solves the world. Incontrovertible is of Latin extraction. The incontrovertible solves the world. Polysyllable integrated with monosyllables. God is a skeptic, generating time. I do it repeatedly. Existence resolves to salvation. We suffer that we presume more than we know to the end of time, to the end of time. Again, strings of monosyllables are the fundamental strength, varying in rhythm with polysyllables of Latin extraction. It's central to Shakespeare's writing and to understanding how Shakespeare wrote. So it's a matter of sound and rhythm and cadence, fundamentally. I did not appreciate English until I came to appreciate Shakespeare. And that was in my later teenage years. It was on a trip to England. I had been reading, up till that point, science mostly, philosophy. I mentioned I would read things in translation. All of my readings of Russian literature, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Turgenev, were all obviously in translation. My readings in French literature and German literature, all in translation. And I read more in translation than I read in my native English because I was drawn to the ideas I was encountering, the ideas of Goethe, more than to what I was encountering in English writers. But then I went to England. I stayed with, my mother was English. She had a large family there. So I stayed in the house of one of my uncles. And I stayed there for several months, actually. The first week I was there, I was going through a magazine, an English magazine, and I came upon a page with an ad for a perfume. And as was often the case with English advertisements, it was illustrated with a quotation. I found quotations from Samuel Johnson and quotations, especially from Shakespeare, were very common, in their advertising. Well, this perfume ad that I don't remember very much about at all. It might have been in black and white. I think I remember some purple. I'm not sure. But I remember the words. And the words were from Shakespeare's King Lear, one of his final works, arguably, many people think, his greatest single work. And the line came from the end of King Lear, this tragedy of King Lear, where Shakespeare is eulogizing this character, Cordelia, the one true good soul that Lear had brought into the world. And she's been hanged in prison. And the line that I read in the ad was, her voice was ever soft, gentle, and low, an excellent thing in woman. I read that line, I thought, this is beautiful. This is more beautiful than any other line I can remember having read in any language anywhere. The next day I went to a famous bookstore, Foyles, in England, bought King Lear, bought Shakespeare, read through all of Shakespeare. Since then, I have mostly read things in English because issues of sound have mattered decisively to me, in the way that those aphorisms that I quoted a minute ago, have a certain sound quality. I had people come to shows of mine where there were aphorisms written on the walls with the art in the center, the pole art that you see behind me, in the center of the gallery space, but on the walls were the contents of aphoristic books. And obviously, philosophical aphoristic writing is concentrated, and a general audience is not necessarily going to have ready access to the meaning without some explanation. Right? These talks provide explanation. But one man came to the talk and to the show, and later he said to me, I can't say I understand all the aphorisms, like their content, their intellectual content, but they communicate through their sound. Well, that represents a significant level of understanding of not just the aphorisms, but of how English communicates. So I read that line from Shakespeare, and that opened up English for me. I wrote about that encounter in Joshua, and I represented it poetically like this. Magazines show scenes of where a nation leans, and what they choose to quote can be an antidote to sagas learned by rote. Even in a perfume ad, catering to a current fad, Lear can go mad. And when he does, Cordelia comes to mirror what he was. And when she goes, the king still knows her voice was the song of the rose. So that's from the books of Joshua. That is the poetic rendering of my encounter with that line from King Lear. Her voice was ever soft, gentle, and low, an excellent thing in woman. And to show you something of the magnitude of Shakespeare's writing, that is followed with the line, I killed the slave that was a hanging thee. I mean, an extraordinary contrast of a eulogy verse, and then followed by a resurrection of will, in this aged king. That was one of his final acts of defiance of fate. And again, Shakespeare, very concentrated, in his writing, and so in the effects he's able to achieve. I wanted to give you another example from Shakespeare. We have a little time before I get to the questions. And that is the end of Antony and Cleopatra, another death scene. Antony is committed suicide. Cleopatra is committing suicide to follow him and to avoid being captured by Augustus Caesar. And she's applying asps. She's using poisonous snakes. And her final lines are, as sweet as balm, as soft as air, as gentle, O Antony, nay, I will take thee too. She applies another asp, and it's the fatal one. And then she says her final words, what should I stay? And her maidservant, Charmian, completes the line, in this wild world. Notice that line, one of the highest points that Shakespeare reaches, that anybody reaches. What should I stay in this wild world? That's not grammatical. It should be either, why should I stay in this wild world, or what should I stay for? But Shakespeare is writing the death of a queen, the death of royalty, of majesty. What has a strong sound? Why is weak? For, to end that phrase, is weak. What should I stay is emphatic. It has a sound that is consonant with, at the level of, the character of the person he's giving the line to, an Egyptian queen. So Shakespeare is obeying the dictates of sound, the requirements of sound to communicate his meaning. Sound is predominant in the communication of meaning in English. It is central, again, in the construction of my aphorisms. Now, a few more things. Shakespeare, as I mentioned, we can remove half of the lines and probably have a tighter work, a work that would be more effective aesthetically. Even Mozart, one of the great dramatic intelligences, his operas are considered to be, in opera, well, considered he's at the level of Shakespeare in his operas, in his understanding of human beings. But even Mozart went on about how in Hamlet, the ghost scenes go on too long. Shakespeare had an immense power over words, and sometimes it got the better of him. He got carried away. Matthew Arnold was a late 19th century, or a 19th century literary critic, English literary critic. Let me show you a picture of Matthew Arnold. Actually, while I'm at it. Okay. There is a painting of St. Augustine. We know what Shakespeare, one of the famous images. That is a painting of the late 19th century of Cordelia, the daughter that Shakespeare, the daughter of Lear that Shakespeare is eulogizing in that line. And here is Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold attended to the issue that not all of Shakespeare, not most of Shakespeare, is at the highest level. He wrote, Shakespeare frequently has lines and phrases in a strain quite false, and which are entirely unworthy of him. Yet one could imagine him smiling if one could meet him in the Elysian fields and tell him so, smiling and replying that he knew it perfectly well himself. And what did it matter? Now, that actually is something I quote in the opening pages of my very first work of philosophical aphorisms before my writing became fully aphoristic. It represents the other solution to the problem of human life, human circumstance, human suffering. The philosophic solution, the Buddhist solution, the solution that Wittgenstein, for example, was seeking in philosophy, that I seek in my work, is a complete solution here and now to every conceivable problem. All that was what Siddhartha Gautama was seeking. He wanted to end mortality, end disease, old age, and death, end suffering once and for all in all of its extremity. The other way to approach the problem is, as Matthew Arnold indicated, not that we need to eliminate all of what's unsatisfactory or what's evil or what's problematic, but that if what is satisfactory, if what's good or great is so much greater that it overwhelms the negative. That's the alternative approach. Obviously, that's not the approach that philosophy takes, but that is the approach indicated here. And I offer just as that alternative, to addressing problems of the human condition. Now, I wanted to, just in closing, quote two things. As long as we're aiming for exposure to the highest that a mother tongue is capable of representing, and the highest in English is Shakespeare, I wanted to quote something from King Lear at the end, prior to those lines where Cordelia and Lear are still alive together. They've been captured, they've been defeated in battle, but now they have the option of going off to prison together and living out their life. At least Lear has this imagining of what's possible. It goes like this. And again, this is at the summit of the Shakespearean achievement. Come, let's away to prison. This is Lear talking to Cordelia. We two alone will sing like birds in the cage. When thou dost ask me blessing, I'll kneel down and ask of thee forgiveness. And so we'll live and pray and sing and tell old tales and hear poor rogues talk of court news, and we'll talk with them too. Who loses and who wins, who's in, who's out, and take upon us the mystery of things as if we were God's spies, and we'll wear out in a walled prison packs and sects of great ones that ebb and flow by the moon. So that is the ultimate achievement within my mother tongue, within English. And finally, I address Shakespeare, Lear, Cordelia in another verse from the books of Joshua, and I think I'll close with this. And I just wanted to mention too that one of the prominent philosophers when I was at Harvard, Robert Nozick, felt that Shakespeare had the most powerful mind that the human race had ever produced. So even within the philosophical community, he is seen as representing an acme of insight and understanding and perspective, though he was not a philosopher per se. But he was our most valuable writer. So from the books of Joshua, in closing, and there's a reference to Edgar Allan Poe, whose poetry was musical. Poe is sonorous in his woe, sufficiently so to substitute for the mandolin and lute. If we are astute as Joshua and follow suit, that poetry is sublimity, preferentially mute, as the notes Beethoven couldn't hear penetrate and sear, and Cordelia's voice, soft, gentle, and low, answers the mad King Lear. Okay, so that concludes tonight's talk on mother language, on the philosophy of language, and on my mother language, English. I know I've covered a lot of ground, a lot of territory. In some instances, I went quickly, but I wanted to at least give you a sense of the terrain as I see it. Okay, we had some questions from last time that I have time to address. Let me pull them up. Okay, first, what is the connection between human instrumentalities and philosophy? Okay, I make a sharp distinction between philosophy and everything else, right? That philosophy is sufficient unto itself. Philosophy does not seek any end or goal beyond itself. Philosophy uses the internal criterion of an incontestable rigor. That's it. It doesn't care if it makes people happy, if it can build better bridges, if it can get us to Mars. It just cares about the incontrovertible from where we stand, which means that it's not trying to get us anywhere. It's trying to get us to appreciate, to understand where we are. Because the idea within, deep within that perspective is that if the solution doesn't pertain right here, right now, wherever we are, it ultimately pertains nowhere and never for anyone. So that is the philosophical perspective. So philosophy is not an instrumentality, right? Everything else is. Science is an instrumentality. If a scientific theory in physics cannot lead to bridges that can support our traffic, we're going to seek a new science, a new physics. Okay? That the test of science, the test of psychology, the test of our medicine, the test of our drugs, is to heal us or to facilitate certain ends, to facilitate our survival, to facilitate our happiness, if you like, not to facilitate, as the religions term it, our salvation, the complete solution, where we stand. But by making the distinction between the epistemic, the rigorous set of circumstances that we cannot remove ourselves from and must come to recognize if we want that complete solution here and now, making the distinction between the epistemic, that set of circumstances, and the heuristic, and the whole realm of instrumentalities, philosophy can clarify the nature of instrumentalities and can elaborate new and more powerful or alternative or additional instrumentalities. Philosophy, after all, created science as a methodology. Science does not rise to the level of rigor of philosophy, it's lower. When you're at a higher level, as philosophy is in terms of rigor, then you can sort of pull back. You can add parameters, conditions that make what you're doing less rigorous, but more instrumental in achieving a given end. The fact that controlled experiments are theoretically impossible because the world is different in different directions, that two things are not one, means that there's an alternative methodology heuristic, instrumentality, where instead of comparing 2 points, you elaborate the properties or the convergences of a point. And that is an alternative, powerful heuristic that I used in the development of my cancer results and can be used in principle to solve, well, a whole range of problems, right? So philosophy, by distinguishing the rigorous from the less so, the epistemic from the heuristic, the epistemic from the instrumental, can help clarify and elaborate new, powerful methods, methodologies, instrumentalities, and convergence theory, the elaboration of convergences at a point to create an object at that point that can achieve particular ends, like cancer cures, is an illustration of that process. One more question. Have you been to the Van Gogh Museum? What are your impressions? Fortunately, I was at the Van Gogh Museum. I was actually there on a trip right after my experience in New York of doing Phalaris's Bull, solving the riddle of the great big world. That was in 2016 now. When I left New York, I went on a trip to Italy, where I had a friend, and the two of us then traveled together to Amsterdam, where I had never been. And my main interests in Amsterdam was, well, seeing the city, seeing the canals, seeing the Van Gogh Museum, seeing the Anne Frank House, and it wasn't quite in the city, but seeing works of Mondrian, especially his Victory Boogie Woogie, which at one time was my favorite painting. Well, we went to the Van Gogh Museum. As I mentioned, it's a place of pilgrimage. Right? You have to wait hours to get in. I have not had a better experience in my life at a museum than at that museum. Van Gogh, as I've talked about repeatedly, now reigns as probably the most popular great painter in history. I've read a lot of his letters. I've studied his art. One thing he said in his letters about his art that I've liked to quote is, we seek to paint men and women with that something of the eternal, which the halo used to represent, and which we seek to embody in the actual intensity and vibration of our coloring. So Van Gogh is one of those souls, one of those spirits. I mentioned before that it's been said that the failure to appreciate Van Gogh, in the 19th century was sufficient to discredit that entire century. I've also emphasized that wherever Van Gogh was the place to be. Wherever he was painting was the place to be as we look back on his time. So yes, the Van Gogh Museum, I remember specific paintings, but I won't remember just the overwhelming experience of being that close to so many works, especially early works of his. So there's no artist I feel more emotionally affected by. The other artist, honestly, that ranks very high in my regard, in my response, is Picasso. Seen often as a very different type of artist, but just as Van Gogh's work gives off emotion, pure emotion, Picasso has said that his goal was in his paintings to give off pure emotion. So, okay. So that is it, I guess, for tonight, for the talk, for the questions. I hope you all enjoyed the experience. I certainly did. And I look forward to next time. And I want to thank Aaliyah, as always, for her help and support and facilitation of these talks.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you for the amazing talks. We really enjoyed it all. And thank you, the audience, for your feedback, for your comments and likes. We will definitely address all of your questions next week. Again, please make sure to join us next week as well. We hope you have a great week. And thank you very much, Stephen, for being with us. Have a great week and see you all, guys. Goodbye, everyone.
For everyone, see you next week. Bye.